Daniel Harper lost his job at 9:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning, and less than 3 hours later, he made a decision that would change for lives forever. The factory floor was unusually quiet when the announcement came. Machines that had roared for decades stood motionless beneath rows of fluorescent lights. Men and women gathered in small groups, whispering nervously as supervisors walked through the building carrying folders no one wanted to see. Daniel already knew what was happening before his name was called. Sometimes bad news arrives long before the words do. He sat in a cramped office across from a manager who could barely meet his eyes. The rain tapped softly against the window behind them. A coffee machine hummed somewhere in the hallway. The manager cleared his throat twice before speaking. "I am sorry, Daniel. Corporate made the decision last week." Daniel nodded slowly. "How many years?" The manager looked down. 19. 19 years. Nearly half his life spent inside those walls. 19 years of early mornings, overtime shifts, missed holidays, and aching muscles. 19 years reduced to a single envelope sitting on a desk. The manager slid the paperwork toward him. Daniel signed without arguing. There was no point. Some battles are over before you know they have begun. By the time he stepped outside, the rain had grown heavier. Gray clouds stretched across the Ohio sky. Water pooled in the parking lot. Daniel stood beside his aging pickup truck for several moments, staring at the factory building that had once felt permanent. At 39 years old, he was a widower with no college degree, no savings worth mentioning, and no clear idea what came next. The future suddenly looked frighteningly empty. He climbed into the truck and started driving without any destination in mind. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. Small towns always seem quieter during rainstorms. Storefronts blurred behind sheets of water. Traffic lights reflected red and green across wet pavement. Daniel drove aimlessly through streets he had known his entire life. Then he saw them. 3 girls standing beneath a small bus shelter near the County Family Services building. The oldest could not have been more than 8 years old. She held the hand of a younger girl while balancing an oversized backpack on one shoulder. The smallest child stood between them clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. All 3 looked frightened. Not crying, not speaking, just standing there in the rain with expressions no child should ever have to wear. Daniel almost kept driving. Almost. But something made him glance toward the Family Services building as he passed. Several adults stood near a white van. Papers were being signed. Conversations were taking place. One social worker knelt beside the girls, speaking softly. The oldest child shook her head. The middle child wiped tears from her eyes. The smallest girl tightened her grip on the stuffed rabbit. Daniel slowed, then stopped. He did not know why. He simply sat there watching through the rain-covered windshield. A few minutes later, he walked inside the building. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Phones rang behind reception desks. Children colored quietly in one corner. Life continued as if nothing unusual were happening. Daniel approached the front desk. "Excuse me," he said. "Those 3 girls outside." The receptionist looked up. Her expression softened immediately. "The Carter sisters." Daniel glanced back toward the window. "Are they okay?" The woman hesitated. "They lost their parents 6 months ago." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. The receptionist continued carefully. "We have not been able to find a permanent placement." Daniel remained silent. "They are being transferred today." "Together?" The receptionist looked away. The answer arrived before she spoke it. "No." The words settled heavily between them. Daniel turned toward the rain-streaked window again. Outside, the oldest girl was kneeling to zip the youngest child's jacket. The middle sister stood close beside them. 3 children trying desperately to stay brave for one another. 3 sisters who had already lost everything once. And now they were about to lose each other too. The rain continued falling. Cars passed outside. Phones rang somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary sounds filled the building. Yet for Daniel Harper, something had already begun to change. Because on the worst day of his life, when he had every reason to think only about himself, he found it impossible to stop thinking about 3 little girls standing alone in the rain. Daniel Harper spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of his small house, listening to rain strike the roof above him. The old clock on the kitchen wall seemed louder than usual. Every tick echoed through the darkness. Every minute carried another question he could not answer. By midnight, he should have been worrying about his lost job. By 2 in the morning, He should have been calculating bills he could no longer afford. By 4, he should have been searching for a plan. Instead, all he could see were 3 little girls standing beneath that bus shelter. Emily holding her sisters together. Sophie trying not to cry. Little Grace clutching a stuffed rabbit as if it were the last safe thing left in her world. When the sun finally rose over the town, Daniel had not slept at all. He sat at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of him. The house felt painfully quiet. It had been quiet ever since his wife, Hannah, passed away 3 years earlier. Some mornings he still expected to hear her footsteps in the hallway. Some mornings he still forgot she was gone. The silence never completely left. Daniel looked around the small kitchen. Faded cabinets, worn linoleum floors, an old refrigerator that rattled every few hours. There was nothing impressive about the house, yet it was warm, safe, honest. He thought about the girls again. Then he stood up and grabbed his truck keys. By 8:30 that morning, he was walking back into the County Family Services building. The receptionist recognized him immediately. "Mr. Harper." Daniel nodded. "Can I speak to whoever is handling the Carter sisters?" The woman blinked. "About what?" Daniel hesitated. Even saying the words out loud felt impossible. "I would like to know what it takes to keep them together." 20 minutes later, he sat across from a social worker named Rebecca Mills. Her office was filled with case files stacked on shelves and family photographs pinned to a bulletin board. Rebecca listened carefully while Daniel explained himself. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments. Finally, she asked, "You understand we are talking about 3 children?" "Yes." "You are unemployed." "For the moment." "You live alone." "Yes." Rebecca folded her hands together. "Mr. Harper, most married couples with stable incomes would struggle with this." Daniel nodded. "I know. Then why are you here?" The question settled heavily between them. Daniel looked out the window toward the parking lot. He thought about Hannah, about the family they had once hoped to build, about all the plans life had quietly taken away. Then he looked back at Rebecca. Because somebody should be. Rebecca studied him carefully. There was no dramatic speech, no heroic declaration, just a simple answer spoken by a tired man who could not ignore what felt right. The social worker sighed softly. "You know there are background checks, home inspections, financial reviews, training requirements." "I understand. And there is no guarantee." Daniel nodded again. "I understand that too." Rebecca leaned back in her chair. For the first time, something in her expression softened. Not confidence, not approval, respect. Because she had spent years hearing promises. She knew the difference between good intentions and genuine commitment. Daniel seemed different. Outside the office, life continued as normal. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Families came and went. Yet inside that room, a decision was beginning to take shape. News traveled quickly through small towns. By that afternoon, several former co-workers had already heard rumors. Daniel received phone calls from friends. Some were concerned. Others thought he had lost his mind. One man laughed openly. "You cannot even pay your own bills right now." Another friend tried to be gentle. "Daniel, this is not your responsibility." But responsibility has a strange way of finding people who never asked for it. Late that evening, Daniel sat alone on the porch of his small house. The sun was setting beyond the trees. Crickets chirped softly in the distance. The world looked peaceful. Yet inside him, a storm continued. He knew the risks. He knew the numbers. He knew the practical arguments. Every logical voice told him to walk away. Then his phone rang. It was Rebecca. Daniel answered immediately. "Hello." Her voice sounded tired. "The transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment he could not speak. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." Silence followed. The kind of silence that arrives when time suddenly feels very short. Rebecca spoke again. "Emily asked me something today." Daniel swallowed. "What?" Rebecca hesitated. She asked if sisters can still be sisters after they live in different homes. The evening air felt colder somehow. Daniel stared across the fading horizon as those words settled into his heart. Somewhere across town, 3 little girls were preparing to lose the only family they had left. And for the first time since walking out of the factory, Daniel Harper knew exactly what he was about to do. The next morning arrived cold and gray, as if the sky itself was uncertain about what was about to happen. Daniel Harper stood in front of his bathroom mirror tying a borrowed necktie he had not worn in years. The knot looked uneven. He loosened it, tried again, failed again. Finally, he laughed quietly to himself. and gave up. The truth was, no tie in the world could make him look like the kind of man approved to raise 3 children. His savings account contained less money than most families spend on groceries in a month. His truck was nearly 15 years old. His house was small. His future was uncertain. Yet none of those facts had changed his decision. By 9 o'clock, he was sitting inside a conference room at the County Family Services building. A long table divided the room. Papers were stacked neatly at one end. A social worker reviewed documents. Another checked files. The process felt formal, serious, larger than anything Daniel had ever done. Across from him sat Rebecca Mills. She studied him carefully before speaking. "Mr. Harper, I need to ask again. Are you absolutely certain?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Rebecca glanced at the paperwork. "You understand this may become the hardest thing you ever do. I know. There will be challenges you cannot predict. I know." She looked directly into his eyes. "And there will be days when love does not feel like enough." For the first time, Daniel hesitated. Not because he doubted his choice. Because he knew she was right. Love could not pay electric bills. Love could not replace a lost paycheck. Love could not magically solve every problem waiting ahead. Yet some things are bigger than certainty. Some choices are made because walking away becomes impossible. "I still want to do it," he said quietly. Rebecca remained silent for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. It was the first real smile Daniel had seen from her. Half an hour later, he was escorted down a hallway toward a small meeting room. The closer he got, the faster his heart seemed to beat. He had no idea what he would say. No idea how 3 frightened children would react. No idea whether they would even trust him. Rebecca opened the door gently. Inside, 3 little girls sat together on a couch. Emily was holding Sophie close beside her. Grace sat between them, hugging the worn stuffed rabbit. The room fell silent when Daniel entered. Emily immediately straightened. Protective, watchful, far too mature for an 8-year-old child. Daniel recognized the look instantly. It was the expression of someone who had learned not to expect good news. Rebecca knelt beside them. "Girls, this is Mr. Harper." None of them spoke. Grace hid partially behind Emily's arm. Sophie stared at the floor. Daniel pulled a chair closer and sat down. He did not try to impress them. He did not offer promises. He simply smiled gently. "Hi." Emily nodded cautiously. Several seconds passed. Then Grace whispered something. Rebecca leaned closer. "What was that, sweetheart?" Grace looked at Daniel. "Does he work here?" The question was so innocent it almost broke his heart. Daniel smiled. "No." Grace seemed relieved for reasons only a child could understand. Another silence followed. Then Emily spoke. "Are we getting separated today?" The room instantly felt heavier. Rebecca looked down. Sophie gripped her sister's hand tighter. Little Grace lowered her eyes to the stuffed rabbit. Daniel saw the fear moving through all 3 of them. Fear that had likely followed them for months. Fear of losing the last people who still belonged to them. Before Rebecca could answer, Daniel quietly leaned forward. "Not if I can help it." Emily looked at him carefully. Her eyes searched his face for signs of false hope. Children who have experienced loss learn to recognize empty promises very quickly. Yet something about Daniel's voice made her pause. Not confidence, not certainty, just sincerity. Rebecca eventually explained the process. Home visits still needed approval. Background reviews still needed completion. Multiple steps remained. Nothing was guaranteed yet. But for the first time, the possibility existed. The possibility that 3 sisters might remain together. When the meeting ended, Daniel stood to leave. As he reached the door, a small voice stopped him. "Mr. Harper?" He turned. It was Sophie. The shy middle sister had barely spoken the entire meeting. Daniel smiled. "Yeah." Sophie hesitated. Then she asked the question that followed him all the way back to his truck. "If we came to live with you?" She looked down nervously. "Would we still be sisters?" Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Outside the window, clouds drifted across the sky. Somewhere down the hallway, phones rang and office doors opened and closed. Life continued as usual. Yet in that moment, nothing felt ordinary. Daniel looked at all 3 girls. Then he answered with complete honesty. "You will always be sisters." None of the girls smiled immediately. None of them celebrated. They had heard too many uncertain things already. But as Daniel walked away, he noticed something he had not seen before. For the first time since meeting them, little Grace loosened her grip on the stuffed rabbit. The approval process took nearly 3 months, and every single day felt longer than the one before it. Daniel Harper quickly discovered that good intentions were not enough. Forms needed to be completed. Interviews needed to be conducted. Home inspections needed to be passed. Financial records needed to be reviewed. The system was designed to protect children, and Daniel respected that. But respect did not make the waiting easier. Every morning, he woke before sunrise and searched for work. Every afternoon, he filled out applications. Every evening, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. The stack of documents seemed to grow larger instead of smaller. Yet through all of it, one thought remained constant. 3 sisters were still waiting. 3 sisters were still hoping. And every delay felt personal. During that time, Daniel visited the girls whenever he was allowed. The first visits were awkward. Emily remained cautious. Sophie spoke very little. Grace rarely let go of her stuffed rabbit. Trust is not built in a single conversation, especially not for children who have already learned how quickly life can change. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel brought a box of old board games to the Family Services Center. The games had belonged to him and Hannah years earlier. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive, just simple games stored in a dusty closet. Emily studied the box suspiciously. "You play these?" Daniel nodded. "Poorly." Sophie looked up for the first time. "Really? Terribly." Grace smiled slightly. It was the first smile Daniel had seen from her. Small, brief, but real. They spent the afternoon sitting around a folding table playing games while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. Emily became fiercely competitive. Sophie laughed whenever someone made a mistake. Grace carefully moved game pieces with complete concentration. For a few hours, they looked less like children carrying grief and more like children simply being children. When the visit ended, Daniel walked them back toward the hallway. Grace suddenly tugged on his sleeve. "Will you come back?" The question caught him off guard. He smiled gently. "If they let me." Grace thought about that answer. Then she nodded as if accepting an important contract. "Okay." The weeks continued. Bills continued too. One evening, Daniel opened his mailbox and found another rejection letter from a job application. The company had selected another candidate. It was the 4th rejection that month. He stood in the driveway holding the letter while the sun disappeared behind the trees. The future still looked uncertain. Yet somehow quitting never felt like an option anymore. Not after meeting the girls. Not after hearing Sophie ask if they could remain sisters. Not after seeing Grace smile. One night, his older brother Michael drove across town to visit. They sat together on the porch drinking coffee while crickets chirped in the darkness. Michael listened quietly before finally shaking his head. "Danny, I love you." Daniel laughed softly. "That usually means bad news." "This is not bad news." Michael looked toward the house. "I just think you are carrying a mountain." Daniel stared out at the empty street. "Maybe. You lost your job." "I know. You are still grieving, Hannah." Daniel nodded. "I know." Michael sighed. "Then why take on something this hard?" For a long moment, neither man spoke. The porch light cast a warm glow across the weathered wooden boards beneath their feet. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. The town settled into another quiet night. Finally, Daniel answered. "Because they already lost enough." Michael looked at him. Daniel continued staring into the darkness. Every adult who walks away teaches them the same lesson. "What lesson?" Daniel swallowed slowly. "That they are temporary." Silence followed. Michael had no response. Because some truths are too honest to argue with. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called with news. The final home inspection had been approved. Several remaining reviews were moving forward. Progress was being made. Real progress. Yet she also sounded cautious. "There are still concerns." Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "About what?" Rebecca hesitated. "Your financial situation." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Of course. The same obstacle that had followed him from the beginning remained waiting at the finish line. After the call ended, he sat alone in the quiet house. The refrigerator hummed softly. Rain tapped against the kitchen window. Bills remained spread across the table. The numbers had not magically improved. Reality had not become easier. Yet upstairs, 3 empty bedrooms waited. He had spent weeks painting walls, repairing furniture, and preparing spaces that might never be used. One room had blue curtains. Another had yellow walls. The smallest room held a second-hand bookshelf he had restored himself. Daniel walked through each room slowly that night. Not because he was certain, because hope sometimes requires action before certainty arrives. As he stood in the hallway between those empty bedrooms, his phone rang. It was Rebecca again. Her voice sounded different this time. More serious. more urgent. And the moment Daniel heard it, he knew something important had changed. Daniel answered the phone before the first ring had fully ended. He was still standing in the hallway between the 3 empty bedrooms he had prepared with more hope than certainty. The paint was barely dry on the walls. The second-hand furniture sat neatly arranged beneath warm lamplight. Everything looked ready. Everything except the future. "Rebecca?" he asked. For a moment, all he heard was her breathing. Then she spoke. "The review board met this afternoon." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The house suddenly seemed too quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Rain tapped softly against a distant window. Every ordinary sound felt amplified. And Rebecca paused. "They approved the placement." Daniel closed his eyes. He said nothing, not because he was surprised, not because he was relieved, because some moments arrive so quietly that words cannot keep up with them. Rebecca continued speaking, explaining procedures, timelines, final paperwork, and next steps. Daniel heard most of it, but part of him remained frozen in the hallway. Approved. 3 girls who had spent months living with uncertainty would finally have a home. Yet even as relief washed over him, another feeling arrived alongside it. Fear. Real fear. Because wanting to help children and raising them were 2 very different things. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Forms were signed. Meetings were held. Final arrangements were completed. Friends from church brought donated furniture. Michael helped assemble beds. Neighbors delivered boxes of clothing and school supplies. Some people still questioned Daniel's decision. Others quietly supported him. But one thing became clear. News had spread throughout the town. Everywhere Daniel went, people seemed to know. At the grocery store, a cashier smiled and wished him luck. At the gas station, an older man shook his hand. Even strangers seemed invested in a story that had become larger than one family. Then came the day the Carter sisters arrived. The morning sky was bright and clear for the first time in weeks. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Daniel's house. Fresh sheets covered the beds. New towels hung in the bathroom. A bowl of fruit sat on the kitchen counter because someone had told Daniel that responsible parents always seemed to have fruit available. He was not sure if that was true. He only knew he was trying. At exactly 10 o'clock, Rebecca's car pulled into the driveway. Daniel stood on the front porch waiting. His hands trembled slightly. Not from uncertainty, from responsibility. When the car door opened, Grace climbed out first, still carrying her stuffed rabbit. Sophie followed close behind. Emily emerged last, her eyes immediately scanning the house. Protective, careful, always watching. Daniel walked toward them. "Welcome home." The words sounded simple, yet they carried more weight than anything he had ever said. The girls stood quietly for several seconds. Grace looked at the porch. Sophie looked at the flowers growing near the walkway. Emily looked at Daniel, then at the house, then back at Daniel again. "This is really ours?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "If you want it to be." Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and took her sister's hands. Together, the 3 girls walked toward the front door. The moment felt small to anyone watching from outside. 3 children entering a house. Nothing more. Yet Daniel somehow knew he would remember it forever. Inside, Grace immediately discovered the bookshelf. Sophie spent nearly 10 minutes opening and closing dresser drawers. Emily explored each room carefully, inspecting every detail. Not searching for flaws, searching for permanence, searching for evidence that this place might actually last. That evening, they sat together around the kitchen table eating spaghetti. The meal was simple, the conversation awkward. Long silences appeared between questions. Yet no one seemed uncomfortable. Sometimes healing begins quietly. Grace eventually looked up from her plate. "Do we call you Mr. Harper?" Daniel nearly choked on his drink. Sophie giggled. Emily tried not to smile. Daniel laughed softly. "Please do not." Grace frowned. "Then what do we call you?" The room grew still. It was a small question, but everyone understood it was also much bigger than that. Daniel thought carefully before answering. "Whatever feels right." The girls exchanged uncertain glances. No one pushed further. No one forced anything. Some relationships need time to find their names. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The house felt completely different now. Not quieter. Fuller. Upstairs, he could hear footsteps. A bedroom door opening and closing. Soft laughter drifting through the hallway. Sounds that had been missing for years. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. Then he noticed something resting on the coffee table, a small piece of folded paper. Curious, he opened it. Inside, written in careful 8-year-old handwriting, were just 6 words. "Thank you for keeping us together." Daniel stared at the note for a long time. And somewhere upstairs, 3 little girls who had arrived carrying fear were beginning, very slowly, to learn what safety felt like. The first year passed more quickly than Daniel Harper expected, and far more slowly than he hoped. Some days felt like victories. Others felt like survival. Most felt like both. The little house that had once echoed with silence was now filled with movement from sunrise until bedtime. Shoes appeared in hallways. School papers covered the kitchen table. Laundry seemed to multiply without explanation. The refrigerator emptied faster than Daniel thought possible. Life had become louder, messier, and infinitely more complicated. It had also become richer in ways he never imagined. Every morning began before dawn. Daniel eventually found work loading trucks at a distribution warehouse 30 miles away. The pay was modest. The hours were long, but it was steady. He left the house while the sky was still dark and returned home carrying the exhaustion of a man trying to support 4 people on 1 income. Yet every evening, 3 girls ran toward the front door when they heard his truck pull into the driveway. No paycheck could compete with that feeling. Emily changed first. Slowly, almost invisibly. The cautious 8-year-old who once expected disappointment began allowing herself small moments of trust. She started leaving drawings on the refrigerator. She volunteered answers in school. She smiled more often. Sophie discovered a love for books. Every week, she brought home stacks from the library that seemed larger than she was. Grace remained attached to her stuffed rabbit, but no longer carried it everywhere. One afternoon, Daniel found it sitting forgotten on her bed. He smiled for nearly an hour. To anyone else, it would have seemed insignificant. To him, it felt like progress. But healing is never a straight path. One night, nearly 11 months after moving in, Daniel woke to the sound of crying. He checked the clock. 2:17 in the morning. The house was dark except for a faint glow beneath Emily's bedroom door. He knocked softly before entering. Emily sat on the floor beside her bed with tears running down her face. A photo album rested in her lap. Daniel immediately understood. Some grief sleeps quietly. Some grief wakes in the middle of the night. He sat beside her without speaking. For several minutes, neither of them said a word. Finally, Emily looked down at a photograph. "I'm scared I will forget them." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at the picture. 2 smiling parents standing beside 3 young daughters. A moment frozen forever. "You will not," he said gently. Emily shook her head. "What if I do?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. "Then we remember together." Emily looked at him. He pointed toward the photo album. "Tell me about them." And so she did. For nearly 2 hours. Stories about family vacations, birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, tiny details nobody else would have considered important. Daniel listened to every single one. Because love is not threatened by memories. Real love makes room for them. The next morning, Emily seemed lighter somehow. Not because the sadness disappeared. Because she no longer had to carry it alone. The years continued. The girls grew. Expenses grew too. There were moments when Daniel genuinely did not know how they would make it through another month. Unexpected medical bills appeared. School costs increased. The roof needed repairs. The truck broke down twice in the same year. More than once, Daniel quietly skipped meals so the girls would never have to. He never mentioned it. They never noticed. Or at least he thought they did not. One snowy winter evening, Michael stopped by unexpectedly. He found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills. The girls were asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. Michael studied the papers for a moment. "You are drowning." Daniel smiled tiredly. "That obvious?" Michael pulled out a chair. "Danny, you could ask for help." Daniel looked toward the staircase. "I am getting help." Michael frowned. "From who?" Daniel listened to the faint sounds of 3 children sleeping safely upstairs. Then he smiled. "From them." Michael did not understand. Not completely. But Daniel did. Every sacrifice felt smaller because it had purpose. Every difficult day carried meaning. Every challenge came attached to 3 reasons to keep going. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, Daniel walked through the hallway turning off lights. He paused outside each bedroom door. Emily's room, Sophie's room, Grace's room. Behind each door was a child who had once been terrified of being left behind. Now there were school trophies, drawings, Books, laughter, life. Daniel leaned against the hallway wall for a moment. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him. So did responsibility. Yet beneath both lived something stronger. Gratitude. Because years earlier, on the worst day of his life, he had thought he was losing everything. Standing there in the quiet darkness, he realized he had gained a family. What Daniel did not know was that upstairs, 3 girls were learning lessons they would never forget. Not from his words. From his sacrifices. From the lunches he skipped. From the overtime shifts he never complained about. From the dreams he quietly traded for theirs. And while Daniel believed nobody noticed those sacrifices, 3 young hearts were paying attention to every single one. Years have a quiet way of changing everything while making it seem as though nothing has changed at all. The little girls who once arrived at Daniel Harper's front door carrying fear and uncertainty slowly grew into young women with dreams larger than the small Ohio town that had become their home. Emily was the first to show signs of leadership. Teachers noticed it before anyone else. She organized school projects, defended classmates who were struggling, and possessed a calm confidence that made people listen when she spoke. Sophie fell in love with learning. Books filled every shelf in her room. She read late into the night beneath a lamp Daniel constantly reminded her to turn off. Grace, the youngest, surprised everyone. The quiet child who once hid behind her sisters developed a remarkable curiosity about the world. She asked questions about everything. How businesses worked. Why some people succeeded while others struggled. Why certain decisions changed entire lives. Daniel did not always have the answers, but he always listened. Through all those years, life remained difficult. There were no sudden fortunes, no miraculous opportunities, no easy shortcuts. Daniel worked wherever he could. Warehouse shifts became maintenance jobs. Maintenance jobs became construction work. Construction work became anything that paid enough to keep food on the table and lights on in the house. Some weeks were better than others. Most were not. Yet the girls rarely complained. Not because life was easy, because they understood what sacrifice looked like. They had watched it every day. One autumn evening during Emily's senior year of high school, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table studying bills again. Some habits never disappear. The house was quiet except for the sound of pages turning in Sophie's room upstairs and music drifting softly from Grace's bedroom. Daniel rubbed his eyes and looked at the numbers spread across the table. College applications had arrived. Tuition estimates had arrived too. Those numbers were far more intimidating. He sighed heavily. Then a voice interrupted him. "You are doing it again." Daniel looked up. Emily stood in the doorway holding a glass of water. "Doing what?" he asked. She nodded toward the bills. "Trying to solve everything by yourself." Daniel smiled faintly. "Occupational hazard." Emily walked over and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel looked confused. "Regret what?" Emily's eyes softened. "Us." The question settled quietly between them. Outside, wind moved through the trees. A porch light glowed against the darkness. Somewhere upstairs, Grace laughed at something on television. Daniel stared at the bills for a moment before answering. Not once. Emily looked down. Even when things were hard. Daniel laughed softly. "Emily, things were always hard." That made her smile. Then his expression grew serious again. "But you know something?" She shook her head. Daniel looked toward the staircase where her sisters were still awake. The best things in life usually are. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply nodded and stared at the table. Daniel never noticed the tears forming in her eyes. He never saw her quietly leave the room, carrying those words with her. The following spring, acceptance letters began arriving. One after another. Emily earned admission to a respected university. Sophie received academic scholarships. Grace gained entry into a competitive program that left counselors impressed. The house celebrated each victory with homemade dinners and inexpensive desserts. Nothing extravagant, just joy. Yet beneath the celebrations, another reality quietly approached. The girls would soon leave home. Daniel never spoke about it, but everyone could feel it. The first departure came at the end of summer. Suitcases filled hallways. Boxes appeared in bedrooms. Cars were loaded. Emily stood on the front porch the morning she left for college, while Daniel carried the final bag to the trunk. Neither seemed eager to say goodbye. Finally, Emily wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you." Daniel smiled. "For what?" Emily laughed through tears. "For everything." Daniel squeezed her shoulder gently. Go build a great life. One by one, the years continued moving forward. Sophie left. Then Grace. The house grew quieter with each goodbye. Their bedrooms remained exactly as they had left them. Their photographs filled the walls. Their voices lingered in memories. But eventually, even happy homes must learn how to handle absence. Daniel adjusted as best he could. He stayed busy. He worked. He attended graduations. He answered phone calls. He listened to stories about internships, exams, promotions, and opportunities. Every conversation made him proud. Yet every conversation also reminded him how quickly time had passed. One rainy evening nearly 20 years after that first meeting at the Family Services building, Daniel sat alone on the porch watching water roll off the roof. The house was quiet again. Not empty, just different. He smiled as he looked through old family photographs. Emily at graduation. Sophie holding an academic award. Grace standing beside her first professional office. 3 remarkable women. 3 lives transformed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, completely unaware that somewhere far beyond the small town he called home, those same 3 women were having conversations that would soon change his life once again. 20 years can pass in the blink of an eye for those who are busy building a life for someone else. Daniel Harper was nearly 60 now. The lines on his face had deepened. His hair had turned silver. His hands carried the permanent marks of decades spent working difficult jobs. Yet every morning, he still followed the same routine. He woke before sunrise. He made coffee in the old kitchen. He sat on the porch and watched the town slowly come alive. The little house remained exactly where it had always been. The porch steps creaked in the same places. The mailbox still leaned slightly to one side. The memories inside those walls seemed to grow richer with each passing year. Most people would have assumed Daniel lived a quiet retirement. The truth was more complicated. He never became wealthy. He never achieved professional success. The company that had fired him 2 decades earlier had moved on without him. New executives had taken over. New employees had filled the positions once occupied by people like Daniel. The world had continued turning. Daniel rarely thought about it anymore. Or at least that was what he told himself. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, 3 sisters sat together inside a glass conference room overlooking a city skyline. Emily, Sophie, and Grace were no longer the frightened children who once stood beneath a bus shelter in the rain. Life had carried them into different careers, different industries, and different cities. Yet some things had never changed. The bond between them remained unbreakable, and neither had forgotten the sacrifices that made their lives possible. A thick file rested on the conference table between them. Financial reports, acquisition documents, corporate evaluations, numbers and legal language filled every page. Emily closed the folder slowly. The room remained silent. Finally, Sophie spoke. Are we really doing this? Grace looked out the window toward the skyline. We have been talking about it for years. Sophie smiled faintly. Talking and doing are different things. Emily nodded. She understood exactly what her sister meant. This was no longer a dream. No longer a conversation shared over holiday dinners. It had become real. Very real. The company sitting inside that folder had a long history. A history connected to thousands of employees. A history connected to an entire town. And a history connected to one man who had never spoken badly about it despite everything that happened. Grace opened another document. The board approved the final negotiations. Sophie exhaled slowly. Emily stared at the papers for several moments. Then she looked at her sisters. He cannot find out. Both women nodded immediately. That part mattered more than anything else. Across the years, Daniel had never asked for repayment, never hinted at expectations, never reminded them of what he had sacrificed. In fact, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable whenever they tried to thank him too much, which made their secret increasingly difficult to keep. Back in Ohio, Daniel remained completely unaware. His biggest concern that month involved repairing part of the porch roof before winter arrived. One afternoon, he climbed a ladder carrying tools while his neighbor, Frank, stood below shaking his head. You know, most people your age hire somebody for this. Daniel laughed. Most people my age are smarter than me. Frank chuckled. Then his expression softened. The girl's still calling every week. Daniel smiled immediately. Every Sunday. All 3. Every single one. Frank nodded. You did good, Daniel. The compliment lingered longer than either man expected. Daniel looked down at the weathered porch beneath him. They did good. Frank wanted to argue. Instead, he simply smiled. Some truths are too obvious to debate. As autumn settled across the town, unusual things began happening. Daniel received invitations to events he did not understand. Former co-workers called unexpectedly. Community leaders seemed interested in reconnecting. Even Rebecca Mills, now retired from family services, stopped by for coffee one afternoon. Daniel found the sudden attention strange. "Did I miss something?" he asked. Rebecca smiled into her coffee cup. "Maybe people are finally noticing what has been right in front of them." Daniel laughed and dismissed the comment. But curiosity lingered. The feeling grew stronger 2 weeks later when a formal letter arrived in the mail. The envelope carried the logo of the very company that had terminated his position 20 years earlier. Daniel stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was an invitation to attend a special corporate gathering. Attendance requested. Transportation provided. Formal event. Daniel read the letter twice. Then a third time. None of it made sense. Why would they want him there? Why now? He sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the invitation over in his hands. Evening sunlight stretched across the room. Family photographs lined the walls around him. Emily, Sophie, Grace. 20 years of memories watching silently from picture frames. Daniel eventually picked up the phone and called Emily. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." Daniel smiled at the familiar word. "Did you know anything about a company event?" For the first time in years, Emily hesitated before answering. Only for a second, but it was enough. Daniel noticed. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, 3 sisters were running out of time to keep the biggest surprise of their lives hidden from the man who had taught them what family truly meant. Emily's hesitation lasted less than a second, but Daniel Harper noticed it immediately. After 20 years of fatherhood, he had learned to hear things people never said. "Emily," he asked gently. On the other end of the line, she laughed softly. "Just go to the event, Dad." That is not an answer. Trust me. Daniel leaned back in his kitchen chair and smiled. "That worries me." Emily laughed again, and for a moment she sounded exactly like the little girl who used to leave drawings on his refrigerator. "Please, Dad, just come." 3 days later, a black car arrived at his house precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. Daniel felt completely out of place before he even stepped inside. He wore his best suit, which had been purchased years earlier for a church fundraiser. The sleeves felt slightly outdated. The shoes were polished but old. Yet as the car carried him toward the city, he reminded himself that this was only a corporate event. Nothing more. The company headquarters looked dramatically different from the factory, he remembered. Glass walls reflected sunlight across the skyline. Employees moved through the lobby carrying tablets and coffee cups. Everything felt larger, newer, more expensive. Daniel followed an event coordinator through hallways lined with photographs celebrating decades of company history. None of those photographs included people like him. Men and women who had worked quietly on factory floors. Men and women who had built the company with calloused hands before eventually being forgotten. The coordinator led him into a large auditorium. Hundreds of seats filled the room. Executives occupied the front rows. Employees filled the middle sections. Community leaders sat near the aisles. Daniel immediately felt uncomfortable. "I think there has been a mistake," he whispered. The coordinator smiled. "No mistake, Mr. Harper." Then she walked away. Daniel sat down quietly near the back. Confusion lingered. The room buzzed with conversation. People exchanged handshakes and business cards. Large screens displayed the company logo. Then the lights slowly dimmed. Conversations faded. The stage illuminated. A senior executive stepped forward and welcomed everyone. He spoke about change, about leadership, about a new chapter in company history. Daniel listened politely, but understood very little. Then the executive said something that caused the room to become completely silent. "Today we officially introduce the ownership group that recently acquired this company." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Daniel frowned. Acquired? He had not realized the company had been sold. The executive smiled toward the side of the stage. "Please welcome our new owners." The auditorium doors opened. 3 women walked onto the stage. Daniel froze. Emily, Sophie, Grace. For a moment, he genuinely thought he was mistaken. The lights reflected across the stage. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. Applause filled the room. Yet Daniel could barely hear any of it. His daughter stood at the center of the stage. Confident, accomplished, extraordinary. Emily stepped toward the microphone first. Her eyes immediately found him in the audience. 20 years ago, she began softly. 3 little girls were about to be separated forever. The room grew still. Sophie continued. Nobody wanted the responsibility. Grace stepped forward. Nobody believed it could work. Daniel felt his heart pounding. Emily smiled through gathering tears. Except one man. A photograph appeared on the giant screen behind them. An old picture. A small house. 3 young girls. One exhausted father smiling beside them. Gasps spread throughout the audience. Daniel lowered his head. Sophie looked directly toward him. He was unemployed when he met us. Another photograph appeared. Grace smiled. He had every reason to think about himself. Another photograph. Emily's voice trembled slightly. Instead, he chose us. Silence filled the auditorium. Not awkward silence. Reverent silence. The kind that appears when people recognize something truly meaningful. Emily continued. He worked multiple jobs. Sophie added. He sacrificed opportunities. Grace whispered. He gave us a family. Daniel felt tears forming. Around him, people quietly wiped their eyes. The executives in the front row sat motionless. Employees who had never met him listened in complete silence. Then Emily revealed the final truth. Everything we became started with him. She looked around the room. Every success, every opportunity, every achievement. Sophie smiled. So when this company became available, Grace finished the sentence. We knew exactly what we wanted to do. Emily extended her hand toward Daniel. Dad, would you please come up here? The audience immediately rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Daniel remained frozen for several seconds. Then he slowly stood. Step by step, he walked toward the stage. The applause continued. Yet the loudest moment came when it finally stopped. Because when Daniel reached his daughters, the room became perfectly quiet. Emily embraced him first. Sophie followed. Then Grace. 3 little girls he had once promised would never be separated now stood beside him as remarkable women. Daniel looked out across the audience. Then back at his daughters. His voice was barely above a whisper. I did not save you. The room listened. Daniel smiled through tears. You saved me. Not a single person spoke. Not a single person moved. Because everyone understood the truth inside those words. 20 years earlier, a man had lost his job and believed he was losing his future. Instead, he found a family. And sometimes the greatest reward for love is not money, status, or recognition. Sometimes it is simply seeing the people you sacrificed for become everything they were meant to be. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Tell us about someone who changed your life through kindness, sacrifice, or second chances. And if stories of dignity, grace, family, and quiet redemption still matter to you, we would be honored to have you join us again for another journey.